Okay. Welcome, everyone, to this year's convening, Truth and Transformation 2022, Looking Back, Paying It Forward. This is our 4th year hosting this conference and our first ever hybrid event. I am extremely excited about this year's timely and important panels, keynotes, and amazing musical performance. A few quick and important housekeeping items. If you need technical help, please send a chat to the organizers through the Whova chat function under the Community tab, or you can email info@ash.harvard.edu. Please put your comments in the chat box to the right, and we will be reading those throughout the day. Questions for the panelists can be put in the Q&A tab, and we will be culling those to provide to the moderators during the Q&A of each panel. Please tweet and repost to social media. Hashtag Truth and Transformation at IRA_HKS. All keynotes and panels will be recorded, closed captioned, and sent to registrants at a later date. Over lunch, we will have a musical performance by Rai Zaragoza, not to be missed. The musical performance is a true highlight of the conference. You can learn more about all of today's amazing speakers and panelists by checking each of their names on the agenda here in Whova. Please note, today's convening was free and open to the public, and we hope to keep it that way. If you would like to donate to the IRA project, you can do so by following the Donate Now button in the chat. Make sure to click on the IRA project in the drop-down menu to direct your funds to our work. We are honored today to open our convening with Talia Landry. Ms. Landry is a Mashpee Wampanoag tribal citizen and currently works as the communications coordinator in the education department for the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe. She is also a specialist in videography, marketing, and communications. We are privileged to have her here today to speak about the history of the land that we are on.
Katapatash. Kui Kwasanamu. Natasuis Talia Landry, Nu Tomas Masipia, Nu Tai Masipia. Good morning, everybody. You are all in the light for me. You are the first people that I am talking to this morning. Kui Kwasan just means you are in the light, and good morning. And I just introduced myself. I am Talia Landry, and I am Mashpee Wampanoag, and I live in Mashpee. I've been born and raised in Mashpee. The only time I have left residence off my reservation land or my natural homelands is when I pursued my undergraduate in Quinnipiac territory up in Connecticut, where I pursued my degree in communications, and then I followed suit and came back home where I can offer my services to my tribal community, where I'm still continuing to continue my studies. And Katapatanamu, and thank you all for being here today, and thank you all for having me to open up this lovely day. I've seen the agenda and it looks amazing, and I love what everybody is doing. So just a little bit about what I'm going to bring. As we all know, where Harvard is located is on Massachusetts land. Massachusetts meaning the place of big hills. So Massa meaning hill, Chu meaning big, and place of is the sit. So Massachusetts meaning the place of the big hills. And as you know, I am Mashpee Wampanoag. I do come from the Wampanoag land, which is abuts Massachusetts territory. Massachusetts descendants and natives still are living to this day, although they're not organized as far as being as federally recognized as the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe. We do encounter and we interact and socialize with plenty of Massachusetts Native Americans a lot. We have actually consumed some within our own community, just for the matter of fact of us just abutting each other within territory, and natives, socializing and coming together and being able to thrive and continue existence by being together. So that just gives a little history on the Massachusetts people. A lot of the Massachusetts people were lost to illness and pandemic, as well as the Wampanoag people before the shifts, the Mayflower and the colonists came over. We did experience a huge pandemic of yellow fever, smallpox, and different things, and it was a huge illness. So we lost a majority of our nation, which made it so that it was possible for the colonists to be able to set up as much colonies and to be able to progress into different territories as much as they did, because we did lose a big part of our population. As you probably know, Wampanoag is a nation, and Mashpee is one of those tribes out of that nation. So Wampanoag consisted of 69 tribes, and now we're down to 3 that are organized. And as I said before, the same situation as the Massachusetts people. We do obviously have living natives still here within those different tribes, though that they might not be organized to run within a sovereignty as far as a organized government facility. They are still very much, tribal and native and recognized as such and honored as such. And even just a little bit of background history on Harvard. Harvard was developed as a Harvard Indian college, which was very much to impose the assimilation of Native Americans. And that very much didn't change for a very long time. It was the main purpose of the college. It was to send our youth there to learn about the colonistic values, the Christian ways, also to read and write in English, to learn the language. So in the beginning, a lot of our youth was taken to go to the Indian college and pursue that. But then as time went on, more of our leaders and just families did decide to send their sons to the Harvard Indian College, and whether it be because it was what they believed in, because they were, they assimilated and they also converted to Christianity, or because as a strategic plan, because like, as I mentioned before, our huge of our population was deceased because of the sickness that came across before the colonists came over. So we had to be very tactical on how we were going to move, because this is foreign cultural values that were coming on to our land, and it was spreading. So in order for us to stay protected and stay here, there was different strategic plans that I think leaders decided to take part in. And some of that had to do with sending particular sons to the Harvard Indian College, because we even have, certain stories like Joel and Caleb that were sent to Indian Harvard college, but then 2 of their brothers stayed back to stay at the school on the reservation, so that the family was getting kind of the both education values and being able to use that to kind of move forward. Because a big thing within natives as well was even the way to speak English, like being able to speak English was a big thing, was very tactical. And that was something that, Wampanoags in particular were interested in for some of their children to learn, so that they would be able to translate and be able to make these agreements and conversations with the colonists that were encroaching on the land. And as I mentioned before, the culture values were very different. So a lot of what was happening wasn't understood, even just the land as a whole, the taking of the land, like that was something with the colonists coming over and, settling and living off the land, and us teaching and guiding them, Wampanoag people teaching and guiding them how to harvest and to live off this land, as it was different from the European lands that they came from. They were bringing over values and boundaries and stuff that were unfamiliar to our people. So there was agreements that we weren't even understanding completely, because it was based off of the value system that wasn't known to us. So even land, owning the land, even deeds of land, that was a foreign concept, because when Natakim, land in our language is a part of ourself. So it's part of our being, as our body. So it's the same thing as saying my nose. Natakim is literally just comes all the way through to your feet, like your feet are connected within the land. So for people to be occupying land is different. We thought people were occupying land, but the concept of owning the land was super foreign, and it wasn't known until after kind of everything happened. And then that's, we lived within 40 years of peace, and that was the longest that this country has lived in peace. And that really, once that was starting to come to light, and, Medicom and stuff was seeing what was happening, that's when, the Pequot War happened and things started to become awry. So I did want to kind of open up and welcome everyone to, Massachusetts land and Wampanoag land, as I'm on Wampanoag land right now. Because as we know, everywhere that you go in America is native land. We do like to welcome it as a native custom to acknowledge the fact of whose land that we are on when we are a guest on land. But another thing to keep, as well as the theme of what is happening with this conference, another thing to keep in mind is the actual history, and to make sure that we're asking questions and that we're fully aware of the history of what's going on. Like I said, with even Harvard Indian College, it is important to know how that was developed and how it even got to the point that it is today with the prestigious level that it is at now, and how it was really formed within that development of assimilating Native Americans to complete this cycle of the genocide of Native American people. And I really do want to condemn everybody for their work that they're doing today and everything that they're learning, because I know that this is the type of stuff that you do want to learn and know so we can move on and be better. But just do remember, as we do acknowledge the land that we are on, as Native people, try not to turn that custom into something that it's not. Asking, just Native people to make land acknowledgements at certain, let's say situations, events, or anything like that isn't necessarily the most appropriate way. I think the most appropriate thing is to, ask them like this team did today, which was very appropriate as far as welcoming everybody, just being, original people of this land within the First Nations of this land, to welcome, guests and visitors and such like that, but also to give a little bit of education and historical background on the realities of the truth of what has happened, and us being able to accept that and see what we can do to overcome and move forward and really highlight each other for what we are, and really celebrate each other within our cultures and with our just beings. So just try to keep that in mind. And again, I do appreciate everybody for being here. I appreciate for the time to be able to speak. And thank you again. And I'm sorry, I do have to make this brief, but I do want to mention is if people go out throughout the day to keep Wampanoag people in their thoughts and their prayers. We experience a lot of loss within our communities, and we actually experience loss in threes. So recently we did lose two dominant people within our community a few weeks ago, and then we just got harsher news that we lost a young person last night. And so if you guys can keep our family and our tribe within your prayers to help us have that strength to really guide them onto that spirit world, it is very much appreciated. This is a very hard loss, as all losses are, but even just on the concept of, college and Indian college, this young man was on his way to college as he just graduated high school last year. So just keep that in mind and keep us in your thoughts and strength. And I appreciate you all. Katapatanamu, and have a great day. I know it's going to be wonderful with all of the things that you're going to be learning.
Thank you, Talia, both for sharing. You will be in our thoughts. The Wampanoag will be in our thoughts all day, today, tomorrow, the days going forward. And this is a very important history, and we really can't do the things that we need to do without understanding our history. I really appreciate your words. Now I'm going to turn things over to Professor Arkan Fong, the director of the Ash Center, who'll do a few words of introduction, and then we'll get right into it.
Thank you very much, Miriam. And thank you, Talia, for those illuminating and incredibly moving remarks. I certainly will keep the Wampanoag people in my thoughts and my prayers as well. Welcome, everyone. I just want to say a few words to help open and introduce folks who don't know. The mission of the Ash Center is to develop ideas to achieve, defend, and deepen democracy in the United States and around the world. I'm honored to be part of this conference on truth and transformation today. There is no society that has yet achieved a full multiracial democracy anywhere in the world. If we are ever to approach that ideal, we have to first reckon deeply with the injustices and inequalities and exclusions of the past and present in order to achieve a shared understanding of historical injustice. And that shared understanding is an important foundation for building a more fully just and inclusive democratic future for us all. Thank you for coming to this workshop and conference and doing the work that you're doing from many different perspectives across many different dimensions in order to achieve this shared understanding of the past so that we can move more fruitfully in the future. Thank you especially to Miriam Ashkenazi and her team at IRA, to Melissa Danello and the events team at the Ash Center for the enormous labor that all of you have invested to make these conversations successful. And thanks most of all to my colleague, Khalil Gibran Mohammed. Khalil is the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. He directs the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project and is the former director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and which is the world's leading library and archive of global Black history. At the Kennedy School, Khalil also designs and teaches the new course that is required of all MPP students on race and racism in the making of the U.S. as a global power. He is an eminent historian, one of the finest working historians of race and politics and policy in American democracy and American history. And with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Khalil. Khalil, take it over.
Thanks so much, Arkan. I really appreciate that very warm and generous introduction. And I just want to begin by saying that about a year ago, the IRA project, the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project, moved from the Shorenstein Center to the Ash Center for Innovations in Democratic Governance. And we have had nothing but wonderful support from many, many colleagues, and we are grateful for our new home. As you can see with my virtual background, it's a big deal, and we couldn't do the work that we are doing today without the support of the Ash Center. So I just want to acknowledge how important the broader center and its commitment is to what we do. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you personally to the 4th annual Truth and Transformation Conference of the IRA Project this morning. I am Khalil Gibran Mohammed, Faculty Director, and I am joined by so many of my colleagues who I just want to mention briefly in terms of what they bring. You've already met Miriam Ashkenazi, our program director. You will soon meet our research project director, who I will introduce more fully. Our senior fellows, Dr. Gloria Ayi, Angel Rodriguez, Anil Herkadi, Carrie Radcliffe, Leah Wright-Reger, who will be participating along with Dr. Ayi later today. We have a number of graduate students who work with us. I also want to mention Jahida Hernandez Jesram, who is part of our community, and so many others. We couldn't do this work without you, and I am grateful for your continued leadership and collaboration. We are very pleased to have you, our guests, join us today. Close to 1,000 people have registered for this annual conference, a testament to how important is the work that we do to center racial equity, to advance anti-racism as a social norm, and to connect and collaborate with tens of thousands of people around the world who do this work every day in every sector of civil society. A year ago, we took stock of the 1-year anniversary of the killing of George Floyd, along with Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, among so many others, and focused specifically on private sector promises of racial equity. Their pledges to invest in harmed communities, to diversify their staffs, and to make more equitable promotion decisions and leadership choices. We examined the limitations of white majority boards, their blind spots and incapacities to see and find pathways to structural change. And perhaps most sobering, we learned from practitioners committed to providing evidence-based solutions that so little had changed over that year, not because people didn't have a menu of options to do better, to increase innovation and profitability by making equity choices, but that they refused to believe that their businesses would benefit economically from doing this work. To say nothing of the moral urgency of making those choices. Too many CEOs still believe they know better, and what that means is too many are committed to business as usual. At the IRA Project, we take as a given that 400 years of systemic engineering to maximize profit by extracting the labor, land, and lives of billions of people across the world is a problem that won't be fixed by goodwill and promises, but by instead systemic dismantling of old structures, reimagining a new social contract, and perhaps most importantly, reckoning with this past. At the IRA Project, we believe there is no pathway to sustainable racial equity without an accounting for the past. In other words, we believe we must first look backward in order to pay it forward. Last night, we opened with a keynote discussion, a conversation between Congresswoman Barbara Lee of the 13th Congressional District in California and the journalist, scholar, and leader, activist, Melissa Harris Perry. It was a riveting conversation between the two of them to understand the importance of the United States in particular, taking on the heavy work of building a community of practice around truth-telling. And for that, starting with a legislative bill known as HR 19 for a U.S. Truth Commission and continuing advocacy to move HR 40, which is the study of reparations, from the 1977 docket where it first appeared to actually becoming passed and creating the conditions for studying the possibility for reparations in the United States. These two bills represent a crossroads for the United States and an opportunity, once again, to make a different choice, and a choice that should be informed by similar attempts and practices around the globe. And in that way, the IRA Project is beginning to study some of those practices. Our team has been to Belfast in Northern Ireland to study the Troubles. Our team has been to Rwanda to look at the consequences and the efforts to rebuild a nation in the wake of the most devastating genocide committed in world history, the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994. We'll soon be traveling to South Africa and on to Canada to continue to build a research base to help to inform what is possible here in the United States, as well as in the United Kingdom and other parts of the global North who have so much accounting to do. That's why I'm excited today that we will hear from some of the people in other parts of the world who are doing this work there, who are learning like we are from what's come before in an effort to make the case, the strenuous case, that nations, in light of the global realities of colonialism and neocolonialism and the continued problems of systemic racism, will have to come to terms with their past if they are honest about making a difference in the future. That panel, Facing the Past, will come up this afternoon. It will be our second panel, and we'll turn to conversations about memorialization. But before we get there, we're going to start the morning in just a few minutes with the first panel, The Great Retreat. This is a panel that helps to build on last year's conference by taking a historical look at the transition from affirmative action, a policy innovation in the late 1960s and early 1970s to do reparative, redistributive work in terms of making it a requirement that people of color get jobs that they had been historically excluded from. The extensions of affirmative action into education, into other spheres of life, was the natural course of a policy agenda that was meant to address the centuries-old problem of structural racism in the United States, which few people disputed in the mid to late 1960s. Unfortunately, as is so much the case in the United States, when we were more proximate to the problem of legalized segregation, we were also more proximate to the backlash against change. And that backlash won the day. It won the day by setting the stage for the retreat away from affirmative action to what we now call diversity. Now, I've just given you a top-level context for the panel that is about to unfold, but you're going to hear from the actual experts and the practitioners and some lawyers who have done this work from that time to the present. And I can't tell you how excited I am to hear from them. After the first panel and after Facing the Past, which looks at memorialization efforts around the world, we will have a musical interlude, and then we will hear from Alvin Warren, who is the vice president at the Los Alamos National Land Foundation. And he will talk to us about the land back movement in Native American communities and tribal nations. His work is centered in New Mexico, But in all parts of Indian country, as we learned this morning, this work is urgent and necessary and helps us at IRA to connect our work to our colleagues at the Ash Center who are looking at these issues and to help educate you, our guests today, about how intersecting is this work of transformation. And then finally, our last panel will be paying it forward, where we will dive deeply into the conversation about reparations and look more closely at precedents from the past about what this might look like here in the United States and in other parts of the world. I am very excited that you've joined us, and I can't wait to learn alongside you for the remainder of the morning. So at this time, let me introduce my colleague, Erica Licht. Erica Licht is our Research Projects Director and has been engaged in racial equity and organizational change research and training for over 15 years. She is currently leading our effort to build a portfolio of work that will help to provide the evidence and the inspiration for organizations of all kinds in the nonprofit sector, in the public sector, and in the private sector for how to actually do sustainable racial equity work. She's also a former Fulbright scholar and holds a master's in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School. And I'm proud to say she's also a former student of mine. At this time, please join me in a warm welcome to Erica Licht.
Thank you so much, Khalil. And thank you all for being here. Thanks for those kind words. And thank you to Talia for bringing us into this space and Miriam for kicking us off. And Archon for also leading into this day. We're thrilled that you're here with us. We have scholars, activists, organizers, organizational leaders, staff, students. Everyone is here and we're ready for this conversation. So the Great Retreat, as Khalil just shared with us, we put it in the title because we wanted to get right into it. These conversations to advance racial justice are not new. They're centuries old, and even the conversations on organizational change, institutional change are decades old. So we are really privileged to be in conversation with leaders who represent both their own personal and professional work, as well as their organizations who have been committing to this advancement for a long time. We are joined by Dr. Gloria J. Brown Marshall. She's a writer, social advocate, full professor at John Jay College, where she teaches classes in constitutional law, race in the law, and gender and justice. And she's also a current fellow here at the Kennedy School in the IOP Forum. So we have the treat of being with her this semester. Gloria has several stage play credits to her, as well as an award-winning short films, and is a featured essayist amongst many other grants, including the Pulitzer. Elika Dadsetan-Foley is Vision's new executive director as of March 2nd, very specifically of 2020. She joins Vision's following years of work as a director in nonprofits and higher education, years teaching as a professor of peace and conflict studies, and a decade of work in development and humanitarian contexts in many parts of the world. Her original plan was to travel the world fighting injustice. She's really looking forward to growing her roots here in Boston and focusing on Vision's diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Also thrilled to have you local. Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings is the former Kellner Family Distinguished Chair in Urban Education and Professor Emerita at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has served as president of the National Academy of Education, of the American Educational Research Association, a fellow of the British Academy, and many other accolades. She holds 9 honorary degrees from both national and international universities. Dr. Natasha Warku is professor of sociology at Tufts University, also here in the Boston area, and thrilled to continue to collaborate with you. A former Guggenheim Fellow, Dr. Warku studies racial and ethnic inequality in education. Her latest book, Race at the Top: Asian Americans and Whites in Pursuit of the American Dream in Suburban Schools, which came out in May of this past year, explores the growth of Asian Americans in suburban communities. And we are joined, last but not least, by our fantastic moderator, Dr. Stephanie Creary, who is an assistant professor of management at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. pen, and conducts research on the topics of identity, diversity, and inclusion, and relationships across differences. She also currently hosts the Knowledge at Wharton Leading Diversity at Work series, where she engages in these conversations with a variety of experts, and has been awarded the Wharton Teaching Excellence Award 4 times for her work. So we know we have a good moderator here with us today. And without further ado, I'll pass the virtual mic to you, Dr. Curry. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful opening introduction, and welcome everybody here today. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you all in community. I have had the privilege of, I think, reconnecting with the Boston community over this past fall. I've been honored with a wonderful fellowship at the new Institute for the Study of Business and Global Society at Harvard Business School. So I'm actually in residence there for the next 2 academic years, trying to get some more research produced. So I'm happy and willing to connect with you all more going on in the future. But without further ado, I'd like to dive into this conversation. And as we dive into this conversation, I will center myself as someone who is a Generation Xer, who has benefited from these policies, whether we're talking about the legal side of the conversation, affirmative action, but in addition to the corporate side and the educational side of this conversation, that is diversity. So I remember full well entering into graduating high school in the 1990s and entering into the fray of the college applications process and seeing this word called diversity. And it is very sort of a very visceral memory to me, getting all of the view books from all the institutions, including all of those in Boston. I ended up attending school in Boston with pictures of varying degrees of brown people on the cover, and these promises of diversity and what we were all going to learn once we got to these institutions. And then very quickly having this disconnected experience as a college student in the 90s saying, I don't think we're doing any of what we said we would be doing. So that's sort of how I entered this conversation. And I think my work that I do now, studying corporate diversity practices and engaging with leaders, is trying to connect the dots and trying to constantly understand, what is it that we were trying to do? What are we trying to do now? Are these the same goals or these different goals? Is any of this working? And it's with that, I'd like to kick off our conversation with Professor Gloria Brown Marshall. Can you help us to understand the historical backdrop of affirmative action? And certainly there have been a lot of criticism and legal attacks on it. What is it that affirmative action was designed to achieve? Was it about mitigating, eradicating systemic racism? And how did we get to this thing called diversity as a standard in both education spaces and in workplaces? So just want to turn it over to you, Professor Gloria Brown Marshall, to help us understand like the bigger picture here.
Well, for me, and thank you so much for this conference and this opportunity. I think we have to do 400 years in about a minute, because if we go back to 1619, when the 20 and odd Africans arrived in Virginia, they came with their own systems, their own governments. They were full-fledged human beings thriving in their own spaces. And they came from Angola. And Mary and Anthony Johnson were in the Virginia colony, an African couple who had white or European and African servants' land, and then the laws changed. And they could have had the right to have a voice in their community, but instead they were forced out of the Virginia colony. And this is what we've been encountering. 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back, because the full inclusion into the community means that the children they bear would be able to go to school. And so even in Boston, in the case of Roberts versus Boston in 1850, once again, it was this fight over the inclusion of the children of freed Africans into the public school system. And that case was lost. But we had free Africans here, and we had those who were able to thrive in the community, but not fully. When we go forward, we see that it was not just the efforts on behalf of the civil rights movement, but those lives lost. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, the fight for voting rights, all of that coalesced into President Johnson saying that we have to do something affirmative in employment. And that affirmative action in employment meant that there was supposed to be intentional employment of people of color, in particular African Americans, based on that history. At the same time, affirmative action programs began in education as well. The quota system was the first affirmative action program with the set aside of seats. And so those cases then very quickly came under harsh scrutiny, primarily because the economy changed and it was a sense of, oh, now you're giving away the opportunities, you're not allowing white people to compete. So the Bakke decision in 1978 was a decision in which a white older applicant for that time in his 30s, Alan Bakke, applied for a position in the medical school at University of California, Davis, did not receive the position for a number of reasons, but he decided race was the reason. He brought a case under the 14th Amendment. And of course, the 14th Amendment from 1868 was created as part of the Constitution for the newly freed Africans. Now he's using it to say that it was a part of discrimination against his equal protection rights. And he won his case. And from there, the scrutiny as to the balance between what whites are supposed to receive today and what kind of repair should be done for the past was part of the decision as to whether or not an affirmative action program was constitutional. And we go from there, and I'll just go very quickly, to two tracks. One is an employment track and one is an education track. The idea of quotas now has become almost unconstitutional, but then it was struck down completely in the Grutter case against the University of Michigan. And in that Grutter case, we had Grutter and Gratz. Gratz, it was struck down because that was a college case that had quotas. Grutter was the law school case in which race was one factor. And it was from there that we went from diversity from going forward from the idea that we're repairing something in the past. This idea of diversity, that race could be one factor among many factors. And then as we go forward, we saw not just Justice Powell, who was unsure in these cases, but then Justice O'Connor began to discuss this issue of the benefit of diversity for whites. Which always struck me. It was like, well, what happened to the repair from the past of all that's happened? Now it's the idea, in order to have white leadership, who could better understand the needs of their, constituents or the customers in their businesses, they need to have diverse education. So we were just there for diversity for the most part, as people of color. And as we go forward to the Fisher case, we have, once again, race as one aspect in a case and brought by Abigail Fisher against the University of Texas. And I've skipped a lot of cases in between. But it was upheld that you could have one element of affirmative action be race, but they also included in the Fisher case, they would take the top 10% of all the high school students in Texas to go to the university or have the opportunity to go to the University of Texas. And then it was still thought that it was not enough. That was a two-tier approach to first take the first top 10% of all high school students. And that would include high schools that were struggling as well as high schools that were overachieving or achieving high schools. And when the argument was, well, that's still not fair. And so the second tier was to have race as one component. And so it was allowed, but barely. And now that we have this cohort of conservatives, I think that given the Dobbs decision, that we're looking at this sense that any part that a race cautious or a school program could have that includes race is in some way undermining the ability of whites to compete. And so we've gone, as you pointed out, from repairing the past to the diversity for a better informed and well-rounded white person who's going to be a leader, to the benefit to people of color of diversity, when entering schools and being a part of a school community. And I think that's where we are now with these two cases, one against Harvard and the other against the University of North Carolina. One, I have to note, one case from the Deep South at a public institution and another from the North at a private institution, and both of them striking at this sense that another group, Asian Americans, are the ones being cheated out of their fair role in this school community and the benefits that come from higher education.
Thank you so much. That is so helpful. I'm thinking about, I spend a lot of time studying the history of diversity as it emerged in the corporate space, right? And we always attribute a lot of the shift to the Workforce 2000 report, right, released in 1987, that started to say that the nature of the workforce is changing such that there's increasing diversity, racial diversity, gender diversity, and that being like the catalyst for in the early 90s, corporations talking about diversity. But to hear this parallel conversation, and I'm sure overlapping and intersecting at some point in time, like I said, I remember it as a student, but to also understand that what was happening is it was a parallel conversation using the same word in the employment space, and that probably magnified or multiplied, if you will, the effect is interesting. Let me bring in Dr. Natasha Waraku into this conversation, because I know that you have a specific expertise on higher education specifically as well. And I wanted to make sure that we sort of delved a little bit deeply into this before I opened this up to the other panelists. But building on what Professor Gloria Brown Marshall has shared with us, can you please help us to understand how some of these dynamics played out specifically in higher education? Who was pushing for these changes, behind closed doors, publicly, and the notion of there being potentially a trade-off in the shift from affirmative action to what we're currently calling diversity or DEI today. So would love to hear some of your thoughts, your opening thoughts, Dr. Waraku, on this conversation.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much to Stephanie and to all of the organizers for inviting me on this really amazing panel. And it's such an honor to be in this part of this conversation with all of you and in the conference as well. So I'll just take us back a little bit and dig a little deeper into the kind of origins of affirmative action in higher education. So, there's kind of a parallel development. We have what's going on in the federal government, as Gloria mentioned, with federal contracting, but we also have these private universities and some public universities in the early 1960s really wanting to be seen as forward thinking and as sort of, this sort of liberal identity, a response to kind of anti-Jim Crow protests in the South. They wanted to be seen as morally doing the right thing. And so they instituted affirmative action, some of these early adopters, in all kinds of universities, publics like Michigan, UCLA, privates like Harvard, Dartmouth, Brown, Swarthmore, Wesleyan. And these programs were small, both in terms of scale and how many students. Often they were less than a dozen, and just a few universities. But they slowly grew in terms of the numbers of students admitted and also the number of universities practicing affirmative action. And this was really about equity and justice and a recognition of the historical wrongs of racial exclusion. And then, by the late 1960s, with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, the campus protests of 1968, these programs rapidly increased. So, Princeton and Yale were sort of the late holdouts. They instituted affirmative action, in part in response to 1968, also the race riots in 1965. And so you have this rapid increase, both in terms of how many universities are practicing affirmative action and how many students they are admitting through these programs. And so, but again, in this period, it still was very much about racial justice. And I think that language, this was sort of adoption of the language of the civil rights movement. And this moves all through the 1970s. These programs are growing. And then again, as Gloria mentioned, 1978, there's a lawsuit. And the court rules in favor of Alan Bakke and ends this quota-based system at University of California, Davis Medical School. But the kind of tying vote, Justice Powell says, you know, the one thing that you can do that you didn't do, so it's not allowed, but you can have a kind of holistic approach to race. That is to say, and he invokes Harvard admissions, where it's a kind of, you know, you're looking at the whole package. You're not just looking narrowly at giving people points for being part of an underrepresented group. And so that becomes the kind of reigning discourse in higher education, this idea of, okay, well, we have to do things holistically. We can't give people points or have a quota. And the other, I think, important thing to recognize from that case was that it had the rationale that was allowed was that it creates a diverse learning environment. That Justice Powell said that is a valid and a legally acceptable reason to consider race, despite race being a kind of suspect class. And so this idea of the diverse learning environment really takes off in the 1980s. And, you know, Stephanie, you alluded to this earlier. There's this wonderful book by Ellen Berry, The Enigma of Diversity, where she talks about how there's a parallel between what's happening in higher education. So the 1980s, higher ed really picks up and really kind of runs with this diversity rationale that, you know, we have affirmative action because it benefits everybody, including white students, to be exposed to all of these ideas. And, you know, it's happening also in the starting to develop in the corporate sector, this idea of multiculturalism. You know, diversity is good for the bottom line. You want to have people who understand, you know, markets that are, you know, people of color are now new markets. And so you need to hire people of color to tap into those. And even in housing, she documents the way that, you know, in these sort of housing developments are now touting kind of diversity in trying to sell their real estate. And so, you know, we have this shift in the 1970s from 60s and 70s from racial justice to kind of 1980s multiculturalism, right? And, you know, in K-12 education, it's very prominent, right? And so this is the start of, you know, the international potlucks that we all have now in our schools. And the, you know, this focus on, you know, on the one hand, you know, it's a positive development. There's a recognition of race and diversity and a welcoming in a way that there wasn't in the past. And, you know, in higher education, at least, you know, this decision in 1978 kicks off decades long research on the benefits of diversity. And it's true that we know that there are all of these benefits to learning in a diverse race on a racially diverse campus in terms of academic outcomes, intellectual, racial attitudes. So we know that this is a positive thing. But the problem is that what gets lost is this attention to equity, to justice, and to, you know, even this question of reparations. And that sort of falls by the wayside as we sort of foreground diversity and the kind of diversity rationale much more centrally. And we see that, you know, that this continues until today, in part because of these decisions. And, you know, I just want to point out also that when we think of, you know, affirmative action is obviously a policy that is about elites, right? It kind of maintains this idea of meritocracy, right? It rests on the continuation of systems of meritocracy in which there are winners and losers, and says, okay, we just need to fix our system and make it so that everybody has a fair chance to compete. Now, there was a different way that higher education could have gone in that moment, which is what happened at the CUNY system, City University of New York, which was open admissions, right? To say that, you know, what we need to do is really open up our elite spaces to everyone. And, you know, and this is what open admissions advocates argued, that everyone deserves access. And they recognize that, you know, policies like affirmative action were only going to ever benefit a few underrepresented minorities. And the vast majority of Black, Latinx, Native American young people were not going to be able to take part in these systems. And that the way to sort of really expand access was to have these programs of open admissions, connecting universities also to their local communities. And that model really didn't take off. But I just want to point out that there was this moment in which there was a decision to be made about how are we going to reckon with the racial exclusion of our elite universities. And, I think that that's an important thing to recognize, that what we chose to do in the United States, in part because this is sort of part of our kind of national ideology, was to maintain this sort of unequal systems and just try to sort of, quote unquote, correct those systems. So let's see. Well, why don't I stop there? I think I've been talking.
Yeah, so thank you so much. There are so many things that you said that resonated with me, and I'm, as I'm reflecting on my own entry points into this conversation in the 1990s as a student at a university, and trying to sort of contend with what were they trying to tell me was the benefits of me being there, because that's how it was. That was how it was language, right? As we need people like you in this environment, because we're all going to learn and stuff. And then to sort of the realities of what is and isn't happening with respect to, diversity or demographic, composition changes in all the spaces that we're in. But I keep thinking about my students. I don't know what year they were born in. I stopped counting because I find it really hard to digest. And I'm sure some people feel that way when I tell you I went to college in the 90s. But in any case, they were born more recently than I was. And many of them, I do teach at the Wharton School diversity classes. I came there in 2017 after that presidential election. And there was a lot of emotion and a lot of strife on the campus. And so my class was a way to help some of our students begin to talk more effectively about these issues in the context of, work and businesses. Nevertheless, it's always surprising to me that these students think the conversation starts with corporate diversity, and now we're talking about equity. And I'm like, no, actually, let me give you a little bit of the history lesson. We actually started with equity. We moved through this thing called diversity. And so I always think that conversations like this, where we backtrack and say, no, where were we before, and where were we trying to go, and how is that not the thing we're talking about anymore, like equity or systemic racism, and why are we talking about it in this way? It's really important for people to understand, again, this idea of what's gained and what's lost, particularly when we don't keep the history front and center in this debate. So let me actually move forward. There is going to be a time in a second, but I'm just conscious of the time that we have, and I want to make sure we get all voices here. There's going to be a point at which I'm going to invite all of you, including those who have spoken previously, to comment on the things that you are hearing. So never fear, we will get back to you all. But let me move us along to Dr. Gloria Latson-Billings. So speaking of earlier education, your work has been in the field of early education, childhood education, and certainly long before we started to talking about critical race theory as a public discourse, although we would all agree it's been part of our academy for a very long time in a legitimate field of study. But tell us about the landscape of bringing in race consciousness and racism into the curriculum in schools in the 70s and 80s. I'm particularly excited about what you have to share, because this was not in my curriculum, I think, to the same extent that it was in other people's, as a child of like the 80s and 90s. So Dr. Gloria Latson-Billings, please share your thoughts with us.
All right, well, thank you very much. And again, thank you to the Iris Center for this invitation. In many ways, I feel like I will be repeating some of the things that have already been said. So it's really important to know that I entered the conversation as someone who has deep roots in Philadelphia, born at the University of Pennsylvania. And Dr. Curry, if you look into the annals of the Wharton School's MBA thesis, you will find my brother's thesis there on the failure of the leisure industry, tennis, golf team to reach out to its Black client. So we go way back in Philly. I'm going to actually use some slides, and there'll be some repetition of things that have already been said, but I'm using the slides not because I'm enamored of slides, but because they kind of serve as guardrails. I am a poster child for professors who just go on and on and on. So I don't want to do that. So I'm going to share my screen very quickly.
Thank you.
Hopefully you can see that.
Yes, we can see it.
And like I said, some of the things I have to say have already been said. There is a long history. Professor Brown Professor Brown Marshall already told you about the Roberts case. So we go back all the way to 1849 in Boston with this family trying to get their daughter in a quality school. Of course, Boston had outlawed slavery. They had separate schools, but those separate schools were inferior. So there was this attempt to make sure that this youngster got to a good school. Here's just a series of cases. I'm not going through all of them because they've already been talked about, but there is a parallel track here. K-12 versus post-secondary. Work was happening in all of these places. And as much as we like to celebrate Brown, what we do know is there were a ton of cases that came after Brown that rolled Brown back. There is a statement from Richard Nixon to his Attorney General Mitchell saying, start filing cases to roll this back and keep filing them. So then you end up with Rodriguez and Milliken and Dowell, Freeman. I mean, it just goes on and on, all the way to parents involved versus Seattle, who, like Bakke, turned Brown on his head and made it be about white students. Thought it was interesting that Professor Brown Marshall talked about white folks feeling like they needed opportunity. It's not opportunity they are seeking. They are seeking to win. It is not just, I want to have a chance. I want to be ensured that my kids or that my group wins. We talked about the Bakke case. What I find really interesting about Bakke is that there was a look at what happened to the people that Bakke claimed got in school ahead of him. So now it's not only that these Black doctors end up, being vilified for being in med school. Now they're followed. And what we found is all 5 of them are working in low-income communities, serving, a community that is starving for good medical care. So that's one of the early challenges. But I wanted to make a point here about how affirmative action came about, because it really was a 1965 graduation speech at Howard University that Lyndon Johnson offered. And he said the following: you do not wipe away the scars of century by saying, now you are free to go where you want, do as you desire, and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a man who for years has been hobbled by chains, liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race, saying, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe you have been completely fair. This is the next and more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity, not just legal equity, but human ability, not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and a result. And that's the president saying out front, this is what this is about. You will note that within a year, that order was expanded to include white women, who are indeed the major beneficiaries of the policy. The Michigan case in many ways is half a loaf. You have this, you can use race as a factor in the Grutter case about law school, but you can't use this point system in the Gretz case. What I found really interesting about that particular set of cases was that it was one of the cases that we first got to hear the Supreme Court. They broadcast the case on the airways. And Sandra Day O'Connor, you could hear the moment in which she in some ways shifts, because she asked the question of one of the amicus brief filers from the military academy. And so you have a military academy person saying, well, if we can't have more Black students, we're going to have trouble recruiting Blacks into the Army. Light bulb. It's what we call in critical race theory an interest convergence. You mean I can't get these Black and brown people to go fight and die for me? It was really that moment in which you see her change her discourse around the significance. And so now we have not affirmative action so much, but as my previous panelists have said, you have diversity as, quote, the value added phenomenon. Mm-hmm. I went to Stanford in graduate school, and when they do the admissions, one of the things that they count as value added is race and ethnicity.
Mhm.
We had the slim victories of Fisher, and I call them slim victories because the 10%, top 10% of the high school students across the state of Texas are entitled to enter the University of Texas system. So everybody doesn't end up at Austin. Some people go to A&M, some people go to San Antonio, but the top 10% was, but the truth of the matter is Abigail Fisher wasn't in the top 10% of her class. So she was ineligible, but she's going to hop over to another school and say, well, I have better grades. Well, you should have went to that school, honey. You didn't go to that school. So, I mean, it's interesting the way people are manipulating, as I said, not to compete, but to win. And so where we find ourselves now, of course, is the Harvard case. And I would say what spins out of this is an expansion of charter schools and an expansion of voucher programs, essentially saying, I don't need to go to school with those kids at all. So I want to stop there and just suggest to you that the challenge that we are seeing in 26 states across this nation is that you can't even mention the truth. I'm not even having a debate about critical race theory. I'm having a debate about the mention, the teaching of the truth of these United States. And that's where we are. We cannot share a book about Ruby Bridges because it's going to make white children feel bad. And I always say when they bring up that feel bad notion is, where were you people in the 1960s when I was in school? Because I certainly felt bad reading reading Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn and his, often use of the N-word, sitting in an honors class at Overbrook High School in Philadelphia with mostly white students. No one, something about this notion that we can't make certain people feel uncomfortable is at the core of the, quote, debate that is happening in public schooling. And I think it's to the detriment of the society that we will not engage in a conversation of truth. So the idea that we will get to reparations is something that I don't see as feasible at this point. But I think it's still, as Derek Bell would say, just because something is impossible doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for.
Thank you so much, Dr. Latson-Billings. One of the ways in which I tend to study human behavior in organizations is using psychoanalytic theories, particularly system psychodynamics, which helps us to understand the defense mechanisms that people enact and put in place when they feel anxious and unconscious. And so this idea that we won't talk about the truth because it makes us feel uncomfortable invites us to understand, well, what's really the issue here? And you are saying it's about winning and power and dominance and not wanting to lose that. And I would say that so many of us see that, right? Is when we begin to unpack the layers, we can say we don't want our kids to feel bad, or we can understand that becomes the roots or the defense mechanism through which we enact change, when really the problem is we're concerned about losing our place in society. But let me open up also the conversation to Alika. What have you seen in your work? I know a lot of the work that you do, you're actually in many of the same spaces that I'm in. What have you seen in your work, in your organization's diversity, equity, inclusion work over the last few decades, as you begin to, and again, thinking about, we've been talking a lot about law and education. I would imagine some of this feels familiar. And I want to understand how your clients' asks or demands have shifted and changed as we've sort of met with these larger societal issues. So please share your reflections with us.
Thank you. And first, let me say it is such an honor to be in community with all of you and to join you and our esteemed panel. I'm just sitting here learning and loving it. So thank you for this opportunity. So I'm speaking to all of you from the traditional lands of the Wampanoag, which today is called Duxbury, Massachusetts. In honoring, and we've talked about this earlier today, and how important it is to acknowledge the history and heritage of the original custodians. And as Dr. Latson-Billings was just mentioning right now, it serves as a reminder of the importance of truth-telling and accountability. So as I was reflecting on today, I reflected on, in my first life, I was an attorney. So about 12 years ago, I was in Sierra Leone and I worked on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the tribunal there. And it reminded me of how truth and accountability can be so reparative and so transformative. And the essence of justice is truth. And TRCs are just an example of doing the work and applying, for my case, our model to a country's context at the institutional level. And besides the power of the TRCs, it also reminded me of the fact that we so often have neutral expats doing the work abroad. Not only do I now think about what does neutral even mean, when everyone comes into various spaces with their personal worldviews and their personal experiences, but it also reminds me of the assumption that nationals were not capable of doing this work to whatever degree. So as we talk about affirmative action today and how it came to be, this assumption as a form of modern racism, if not also old-fashioned racism, is still very alive in this country's context today. So as you mentioned, as of March 2020, I am the executive director of a nonprofit organization called Visions, based out of Dorchester, Boston, although we're now all remote, doing what is now called diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And Vision stands for Vigorous Interventions in Ongoing Natural Settings. It's an organization that was started in 1984 by 3 Black women from the South and 1 Jewish white man during legalized segregation, when legal segregation was the law of the land. And so when some of the laws changed in the 1960s, our founders watched racism become asymptomatic. Just because the laws were technically changed, it wasn't enough. Justice wasn't necessarily served. It didn't mean that racism was technically illegal now, or that people who believed in it suddenly went away, or that attitudes even changed. It just meant that racism showed up and continues to show up in various places, in our culture, in our interpersonal relationships, in our own thoughts, and in our institutions, in our systems. One thing we mentioned in our organization is that racism is expressed at multiple levels. The work also needs to be done on all those 4 levels: personal, interpersonal, cultural, and systemic institutional, for any true change to actually be made. So, this disease of racism and oppression started here in the United States on these lands since 1619. Well, actually, since the Europeans landed on these shores, before that. So there has been, and there is, a lot of work that needs to be done to correct the historical wrongs: structural work, personal work, spiritual work, intergenerational work. So as we're talking about how our work at Vision has shifted through the decades, when we first started out in the early 1980s, we introduced racism and other isms as part of the work, in terms of, the power imbalances are still quite alive and well. And we were hearing people say racism is no longer in existence. So our first job was really to confront that myth, first and foremost, challenging the notion of being a post-racist nation. And then the shift became, as many of my panelists have mentioned, the shift became more practical and palpable when it became a business case, when it became more of an organizational case. Affirmative action was really an interesting point toward, how to change inequities. And that was really just the beginning of the conversation. So as, because I'm so new in the organization, I spoke to one of our co-founders and my mentor for many individuals, Dr. Valerie Batts, and we were reflecting together just through her experiences and the personal anecdotes. And in terms of the conversations, the first time, Dr. Batts remembered the conversations happening was diversity in corporations. It wasn't so much in the educational systems at the time. And it was really because corporations started to think globally. And as mentioned, we want our staff to look like the people we're selling our products to. It's good for us as a corporation. And talking about racism as a US issue also really helped make it pragmatic, getting people to really listen to the conversations that were happening. So corporations were really amongst the first folks to hire diversity consultants, individuals like Jane Elliott and Dr. Roosevelt Thomas, who was an African-American man, and Dr. Jeff Howard from Harvard, and other African-American men who were true leaders in these conversations. And after 1964, few folks really emerged doing what at the time was called anti-racism work. And, including C.T. Vivian, for example, from Atlanta. And the intention of the work at the time was really having white people feel what Black people felt, so Visions worked with people who worked, with C.T. Vivian and Reverend Jesse Jackson. And there was a memory that Dr. Val shared with me with a white banker at one of the sessions who said, "Please don't yell at me. I just was yelled at by Reverend Jesse Jackson." And she had to say, "We're not in the business of yelling at people." And the reality was, at the time, it was a confrontational model. The intention was to have people feel what it felt like to be oppressed, to be able to step into the shoes of others and understand how that feels. And in our workshops, people still sometimes struggle with the fact that one of our guidelines in the organization is no blame, shame of others or yourself. And so sometimes it feels soft, or too soft for individuals. And the idea of racism is really an essentialist idea. It's, socialized into us as people, and it's something that we've caught along the way with all the isms. And so we use more of a process model, which is both powerful and a much more subtle model than the confrontational model. So in terms of, initially, as I mentioned, the work was more confrontational, and following the first wave of awareness of doing anti-racism work, again, what was called at the time, our founders became aware that those models of those models in the late 1970s while they were in graduate school. And then by 1984, corporations really were doing a lot of what is now called DEI. So we worked with several Black HR personnel bringing in these types of trainings because there's a realization that white staff and staff of color were struggling to work together. So affirmative action brought people in, and little was done to actually prepare the climate of the workplace. So then the conversation of representation moved to retention. How do we have individuals stay in these spaces? How do we bring people in and then value them? And without making others, white others, feel like something's being taken away from them, for example, in the workplace. So conversations of reverse discrimination were coming out, conversations of then in terms of implicit bias. So if we're talking about equal playing grounds, what is an equal playing ground? Are we talking about, do we talk the same? Do we want to go to the same schools? What are the comparisons that we're making? And then in terms of into the 80s and 90s, it was helping people really see that racism still existed. And Dr. Val developed a concept of modern racism that really in 1970s in graduate school, and brought it into the mainstream of this work. So people might have been talking about, implicit bias or unconscious ways of reflecting racist attitudes, even when they didn't think that they were being racist. And she brought in a lot of psychotherapy work, so the interpersonal impacts and the spaces. So then it changed from, looking at racism, old-fashioned racism, where organizations were keeping people out, and then, an attitudes creating tensions in the workplace. And how do we have people stay in the organization? So how do we work on the retention? And then how do we correct previous inequities? At the time, Congress had already introduced legislation, and it hadn't really been getting a lot of movement, until now, really, but in the 1980s. And so although there had been a lot of awareness, activism was really growing in the 1980s. So, conversations around gun violence and Reverend Al Sharpton's work and health and public health, in academia, as was mentioned earlier. So it was really starting to become more dispersed in different spaces. And when we talk about today, in terms of what we're seeing, organizations these days are really looking much more, how do we change our culture? Although many might be struggling with the fact that the issue is a cultural issue, even if they don't know that, we see that they're being negatively impacted at the lack of understanding at the cultural level. And we actually say it's the hardest thing to notice is, that type of need for change. And the challenge, cultural change takes time. And often organizations really want that quick fix, that checkbox, what we call drive-by DEI. And so yet we're looking at ways of changing how the way people speak, languages people are speaking to one another, or shifting worldviews. And that at the institutional level means looking at reparations. So, equitable representation and institutions looking at historical practices and how to make amends for that. As now we've seen with Harvard's Legacy of Slavery Fund. So, as you're asking the question, if organizational leadership has done the work themselves, it's much more likely to support culture change. And if not, if certain pockets in the organization are pushing for it, just like community organizing can occur, if there are the right people and the resources and so on and so forth, it might work as well. But it's a process. And so, a lot of organizations are still doing performative work. And in all reality, it's not necessarily intentional. It's you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
So in terms of creating that culture of inclusion, it's also, really just a matter of being willing to address those power differentials. So I'll stop there for now because I know that we can.
Thank you so much, Elika. I really appreciate your remarks. You had me thinking about several of the things that have been mentioned so far. I want to open this back up to the panel as a whole. And then there's a question that came in. And I think same things are triggering me that are triggering the audience. And there's always a criticism that is leveraged against us, the elites, when we have this conversation about affirmative action, diversity, and people say, well, it sounds like a black-white thing, but we know that there are lots of marginalized groups, and Asians and Latinos and Hispanics suffer from some of the same challenges. And so I'm not negating any of that. I'm saying yes, amen. But I do remember a time when again, my own experiences being in school where it was a black-white conversation intentionally, where other racial ethnic minority groups did not consider themselves racial ethnic minorities or people of color. And so there was a lot of other cultural dynamics happening. So which sort of allowed this to sort of manifest as a black-white issue. To that end, one of the questions from the audience is about this idea that sometimes when we create these policies and practices, they have we can either say unintended or intended consequence of pitting minorities against one another. And so I want to open that up because we've definitely mentioned the case against Harvard, which is in fact an example of this. But I guess the question is it's just an invitation to reflect on this sort of black-white dichotomy that's always always been something underlying this conversation, but this notion of other marginalized groups and where they fit in. How are we doing from your perspective, and what do we need to do as we begin to think about really achieving these goals? So Natasha, let me jump to you first, and then we're going to go to Gloria Brown-Marshall. Yes, Natasha.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And I think it's problematic that I feel like we haven't talked about it enough, because I think it's led to the case that we have in the Supreme Court right now. So I think, when we think about Asian Americans in particular, Asian Americans have, because of U.S. immigration policy, we see has led to Asian Americans having high levels of immigrants having high levels of education. And so over half of Asian Americans in the United States have a bachelor's degree. That's actually higher than ordinary Americans in general. And that's because who comes from Asia is not a cross-section of people from Asia. These kind of, obviously there's incredible variation among Asian Americans. The undocumented population is also the fastest growing undocumented group in the country today. But the kind of overall trends are driven largely by Indian and Chinese immigration, and people who come from those countries, again, tend to have high levels of education. And so because of that, because for all racial groups, if your parents have a college degree, you're more likely to do well in education. And because of the education systems in Asia that are largely test-based, Asian Americans are doing well academically. And so then this question of, I think Ed Blum, in this case in the US Supreme Court, very cleverly said, aha, well, here's a racial minority group. And, you know, and I think, you know, there was some question about, do Asian Americans, you know, experience racial discrimination? Of course, in certain contexts, Asian Americans absolutely experience discrimination. We've seen it in, you know, racial attacks on the subway and in public against particularly East Asians in the last 2 years. Asian American kids are more likely than any other racial group to get bullied in school, you know, so there are other domains, but I think it's important to recognize the different racialization, right? But when they're stereotyped by teachers, are stereotyped as high achieving, right? Which we know can have a positive impact on your education, as opposed to, you know, the stereotypes of Black kids, which can be detrimental to their achievement. And so I think it's really important to recognize like the different ways that we get racialized. And to understand that, you know, this issue of, you know, is there discrimination towards Asian Americans is a completely different question to, you know, this question of diversity and equity and opportunities for Black, Latinx, and Native American youth. And to try to pull those together, I think is incredibly dangerous. But I think it's important to say that, yes, Asian Americans experience racial discrimination in some domains, but it's different to the kinds of racialization and racism experienced by Black Americans, Latin Americans, Native Americans. And that is not a part of, you know, academic achievement. That's, you know, in some ways that racialization has helped, you know, there's a lot of reasons for Asian achievement, but that you know, can play a role it can play a positive role.
And I think
and so, you know, I just think this is a really important distinction to be made, because I think also the right is sort of using this to try to pull Asian Americans into their sort of anti-affirmative action and anti-racial justice.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that you bring up, and Dr. Bramash, I'm going to go just to you in a second, is this idea that I think what you're also trying to make explicit is the problems are different and require different solutions, right? And I think that's what we're talking about is it's like different people go to the doctor for different reasons, but don't all need the same medicine. So let's treat the problems as different and give the right medicine to those problems, as opposed to trying to treat it with the same. But I know, Dr. Brown-Marshall, you've been trying to get in here on this conversation. What's coming up for you as you reflect on what you've heard, and certainly my pointed question from the audience member?
Well, let's if we could just turn it around a little bit. I'm a child of busing. Many people think that busing took place only in the 1950s and 60s, but no, there were people being bused across town into the early 2000s. And I also have a background working on school desegregation cases. Those cases didn't end with the Charlotte case. Those cases went on into the parent involved case, in which Chief Justice John Roberts said, in order to stop discrimination, just stop discriminating. Mm-hmm. So you have Supreme Court justices who have a very simplistic idea of what racism really is. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I want us to understand that diversity is not the true issue here. Going back to what Dr. Billings said, we had diversity in 1619. When the 20 and odd Africans arrived in Virginia, we already had the people from Scotland, from Ireland, from the Netherlands. We had the Powhatan Native Americans. So this is all about power. Mm-hmm. And the power is about who is going to compete and be able to continue to compete and still stay at the top tier, no matter, even if the past was based on violence, law, and oppression in order to maintain that superior place. And now that we have more insights into the use of violence, law, and economic and social injustice and oppression, it doesn't mean it's gone away. It just means that they have to have different tactics in full daylight, you know, when these things are taking place. But I want to circle back to this idea that we've been part of a ploy of divide and conquer that's been so successful for so long. And divide and conquer means that you're trying to create an enemy or an opponent we don't have. When you look at the amicus brief that was filed on behalf of student organizations here on the Harvard campus, you have as part of that the Harvard Japan Society, Harvard Korean Society, Harvard Latino Alumni Society. And then when you go into some of the other organizations involving people from Asia, the Harvard Asian American Brotherhood and the Harvard Asian American Alumni Alliance, you have the Harvard Vietnamese Association, the Harvard Radcliffe Chinese Students Association. So when you start looking at the other organizations that are saying, don't try to use us to undermine the progress or undermine affirmative action, we will not be used in that way. But the court thinking simplistically, of course, after Dobbs, it's just using its supermajority to decide to recreate a 1950s society. I mean, if you read the book When Affirmative Action Was White, the use of or abuse of the GI Bill, or the idea that Italians and Irish were once considered those subjugated groups that were not among the white European Protestant. I mean, there are so many ways in which the rules turn, twist, and keep moving around, morphing based on the progress that people of color make. And so we need to understand, yes, there is an argument being made, but underneath that argument is another way to control this society. And as we go into the year 2045, and this country becomes majority people of color, we're looking at education as well as voting rights in many ways in which there is going to be a continued repeat of this need to maintain white supremacy by any means necessary. And this is just one of those weapons. So we're having this discussion now, which is great, but underlining all of this is power, and the rules change to maintain that power. And we are fighting it right now, but historically, it's always going to be morphing and rising, and 2 steps forward and 1.5 steps back. But those 2 steps forward are quite necessary, crucial steps.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn.
Can I just interject
Yes,
here?
absolutely. I was just about to turn to you. So yes, please.
And I just want to point out that this black-white divide is a discursive trope that people have used for centuries. So you have 8 white people on a jury and 2 blacks, and you call it diverse. But if you have 8 black people on a jury and 2 whites, it's a black jury. Look at the OJ trial. Everybody on that jury wasn't black, but it's called a black jury. It's interesting to me that, we have this way of associate. If you can associate it as black, then somehow it's devalued. Hip hop is a world renowned art form. I have not been anywhere in the world that people were not engaged in hip hop. But if you say it in the US, oh, that's that black stuff. So even though the numbers show us that the major beneficiaries of affirmative action are white women, we somehow can't get past this notion that that's that thing that lets, quote, unqualified black people have access. So it is a trope. It is something that I think we will always fight, because one of the ways that you discount something in this nation is to call it black. I also would just add real quickly, I asked a question of teachers all the time: who is the best performing subgroup in American schools? They quickly say Asian students. That's not true. The best performing subgroup are Nigerians. Nobody is killing the game like Nigerians, but somehow you cannot get in your head that someone with that skin color could be at the top. They are the same as Natasha mentioned. They're privileged folks who come out of Nigeria, parents in the petroleum industry, they're engineers, they're doctors, and their kids go to mostly, when we see a citation about a youngster getting into all the Ivies, they're typically Nigerian. So it's funny to me that blackness has been associated with degradation and the worst of the society. And it keeps happening over and over and over. So what we're really actually talking about is what I would call conceptual blackness.
Yeah, yeah. What I also wanted to say, though, and why I wanted to turn to you, as well as you did bring up the point around white women being the biggest beneficiaries, but again, I'm not the legal scholar here, but I do know enough when I teach this in my class to my students, is that race isn't the only thing considered under affirmative action. It's women, gender, it's veterans and people with disabilities and certain classes of veterans. And all of you who are legal scholars can, refine
and legacies.
And
legacies.
legacies.
We can't even talk about legacies.
And legacies. And I say all that to say that, to your point, Dr. Ladson Billings, is that the controversy and the backlash has been when it's been about Black in these rulings. When it's been about all of these other groups. And that's something that we have to contend with. I so wish we could go on for another hour, but we are at the last minute. So let me just get, there's one question that came in around the term inclusive excellence. And I'm going to throw that out there. And if I can get someone to pontificate on how they feel about this term inclusive excellence in about 30 seconds, that would be great to close us out. Is there anybody who would like to take a notion of this term inclusive excellence and what that means to us? No takers. Well, then I will take it. And I will say what's really interesting is what we've come to understand is the term inclusion became the next generation of this. So if we're not going to talk about justice and we're not going to talk about equity, inclusion became the thing that's about all of us, right? And where that became problematic for many organizations, they stopped talking about diversity in an effort to talk about inclusive excellence. So while I'm a person who understands that there is, and a scholar who understands that there is a benefit to talk about inclusion without diversity, without justice is really problematic. And I would urge all of us as scholars, as practitioners, as policymakers to make sure that our efforts to recognize everyone's needs, that we don't begin to dismiss and continue to hide and marginalize the people with whom we originally had in mind when we were creating these policies and these initiatives. I thank you all so much for being here. I've learned a lot. I start teaching my class again on Monday, so now I have a lot more content to put in there. And thank you all to the IRA Project for having us here. And I look forward to continue to engage with you guys in conversation about this in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Creary, and thank you to all of our panelists, Dr. Ladson Billings. I was going to say Dr. Brown Marshall, I should say Esquire, Dr. Warku, and Dr. Dodson Foley. I'm really struck by two things in particular. The rules keep turning and twisting to pit groups against each other. Dr. Brown Marshall reminded us of that, and to maintain white supremacy by any means necessary. I think that is so salient and so clear from this conversation that if we look across the decades, it's the same weaponized narratives, and that they're also evolving in real time now. As Dr. Ladson Billings reminded us, it's this divisive trope that people have used for centuries to divide, both between Black and white and between many racial and ethnic marginalized groups. Thank you all so much. We are really, truly appreciative for all 5 of you spending time with us this morning. Thank you for your contributions to this event. And to the audience out there, please come back for panel 2 at 11:30 a.m. You can find it in the agenda tab on Whova. Just click on panel 2, and we will be facing the past, looking at efforts of memorialization museums in the US and